In the USA, an entire family was arrested for abusing a teenage girl. They didn't let her eat, and at 14 years old, she weighed only 16 kilograms. At the same time, the other family members suffered from extreme obesity. Today's story begins with Walter Goodman, about whom little is known. Walter was born in 1978. He spent most of his life in Anita, Wisconsin, where the main events of the case unfold. In high school, Walter met a girl named Alice. A connection formed between them, but they dated for a very short time, and soon their paths diverged. After finishing high school, Walter got by with odd jobs. But he didn't just change jobs, he also had many short-term relationships with girls. The guy couldn't choose the one with whom he wanted to spend his whole life. As a result of constantly changing partners, Goodman had 2 children, but he couldn't be called a good father, so the children didn't communicate with him, and he didn't care about them. When Walter turned 30, fate brought him back together with Alice, his high school sweetheart. They immediately found common ground and resumed their romance. However, the relationship was far from stable because neither partner was ready for serious commitments. Once again, after arguing over a trifle, the couple broke up and each went their own way. A few months later, Alice called Walter and stunned him with the news of her pregnancy. The woman claimed that Goodman was the father of the future child. The man was unhappy with this turn of events and doubted the words of his former lover. He already had 2 children in whose lives he took no part. Why did he need a third? Walter categorically did not want to become a father again. The first thing he asked Alice was how she even knew who the child was from, if she slept with anyone. Walter had heard that, after breaking up with him, Alice had managed to change more than one partner. He always considered the woman frivolous, so he demanded proof. The man, of course, was not going to waste money and time on other people's babies. In 2011, Alice gave birth to a girl and did a paternity test. Walter Goodman really turned out to be the biological father of the baby, no matter how much he denied it. When MJ was born, Walter was not around. He first appeared in his daughter's life when she was 4 months old. Goodman was in no hurry to take on the role of father because he didn't care about his children. Communication with the newborn daughter was limited to rare visits and expressing dissatisfaction with her mother. And then the man stopped communicating with the girl altogether. MJ lived with her mom, Alice, and grandmother Joanne, and for several years she did not see her father. Despite the fact that MJ went to school, easily made friends, and led what seemed like a normal life, there were some oddities in her behavior. Teachers described her as a healthy, content, happy girl, but at the same time, she was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism. This is a neurological disorder in which a person faces difficulties in communication, perception of the surrounding world, and building social interactions. Meanwhile, Walter finally moved to New York and continued living his life. He didn't even remember his daughter, which was very typical for him. The man changed jobs and relationships, not staying in one place for long. In 2014, he ended up in prison for non-payment of child support for one of his children. After his release, Walter finally settled down. He met a woman named Melissa. She turned out to be as complex a personality as he was, and their acquaintance quickly turned into a romantic relationship. And in 2016, Walter and Melissa got married. All this time, MJ continued to live separately from her father. In 2020, when she turned 9, the pandemic began. Due to quarantine, the girl was forced to stay home and study online. In addition, the isolation was aggravated by another stress. In the spring of 2020, just a few weeks after the introduction of quarantine, MJ's mother Alice was arrested. The reasons for the arrest were not disclosed, but this event greatly affected the girl's life. Unfortunately, Alice disappeared from her daughter's life for a very long time. Because of this, the girl moved from one relative on her mother's side to another, and at some point she lived with her aunt and then with her grandmother. But when it became clear that Alice's return from prison was not planned in the near future, the guardianship service decided to find the girl's biological father and send the child to him. Social workers explained to the man that while MJ's mother was in custody, the girl needed somewhere to live. They asked Walter if he was ready to accept his 9-year-old daughter. And Walter, who was completely uninterested in the lives of his children and did not pay them child support, for some reason agreed. This decision turned out to be the worst thing that could happen to MJ, and it completely changed her life. So the girl moved to her new family's home, where 4 adults already lived in not the best conditions. The house was located in a trailer park in Anita, Wisconsin. Her father, 42-year-old Walter Goodman at that time, did not work due to health problems and spent most of his time at home. The man suffered from painful obesity and had serious liver problems, due to which he was on the transplant waiting list. Also, living in the house was his wife, Melissa, who was 3 years older than her husband. She also had very poor health. Due to her enormous weight, the woman was bedridden and could barely move around the house. She did not work and practically did not leave the house. Melissa's 20-year-old daughter, Savannah, like her mother, suffered from obesity. She was in a very similar situation, barely getting out of bed and unable to work. There was another child in the house, Melissa's 10-year-old son. As a child, the boy was diagnosed with cancer, and now he was undergoing treatment. The family lived on what they received from the state: social benefits, additional payments for the son's cancer treatment, and free food stamps. And finally, the 4th adult in the house was Kayla, Savannah's girlfriend, who also couldn't boast of slimness and grace. She was about 20 years old, and she was the only one in the family who worked. Kayla worked in a kindergarten. So, now 6 people lived in the house, 4 adults and 2 children. Initially, everything went well, and there were 4 bedrooms in the house. Walter and Melissa shared one between them. Kayla and Savannah occupied another. Melissa's son had his own room, and MJ was also given a small bedroom. Due to the pandemic, the girls' school classes were held online. MJ's grandmother, on her mother's side, regularly called Walter's family and inquired about her granddaughter's affairs. They couldn't meet, all because of the same restrictions, and MJ had to communicate only with those she lived with. Over time, the situation worsened. About a year after MJ moved to the new family, her father began to complain about his daughter's behavior. Walter claimed that due to autism, the girl began to show certain character traits and abnormal habits. For example, she constantly picked at her skin, scratching it until it bled, and then tore off the forming scabs. In addition, due to autism, MJ became very picky about food and sometimes refused to sit at the table with everyone at all. She could go without eating for several days. All these statements were strange because before moving to her father, MJ had none of these problems. Her mother Alice's family, with whom she lived most of her childhood, and the teachers who taught her at school said that she was happy, healthy, and content with life. In fact, many teachers at school didn't even suspect that the girl suffered from autism. However, after moving to her father, MJ's life changed dramatically. She couldn't fall asleep for a long time, stopped eating, and constantly itched. This explained the appearance of ulcers and other problems on her skin. Walter blamed the change in behavior on MJ's diagnosis, her autism, and used it as an excuse for why he began to treat his daughter badly. It all started with him locking the girl in her bedroom, installing a bolt on the door from the outside so she couldn't get out. In a second, MJ became a prisoner in her room, and this led to a deterioration in her condition. According to Walter, MJ refused to eat. With each day, her portions became smaller and smaller. The father claimed that no matter how much they brought her, she still didn't eat. Because of this, the girl lost a lot of weight. It should not be forgotten that this was the version expressed by Walter. Perhaps in this way he was trying to justify his behavior or shift the responsibility for what happened onto MJ's illness. Apparently, at some point, the father got tired of taking care of his daughter. Once, Goodman confessed to his friend that if he could, he would leave MJ somewhere in the forest so she wouldn't interfere with their lives. Walter also installed cameras in his daughter's bedroom so that he and the other residents of the house could watch MJ's behavior 24 hours a day and control her tendency to self-harm. If the girl did something that the family members didn't like, they talked to her through the camera. In Walter and Melissa's bedroom, there was a monitor that broadcast video from MJ's room around the clock, and the husband and wife took turns on duty at the screen. It was like round-the-clock work, without days off. Meanwhile, the schoolgirl spent more and more time in her bedroom. She was no longer allowed to move freely around the house. She was accompanied everywhere by one of the adults. Even to the toilet, she was taken under supervision. At some point, this activity bored the whole family. They didn't want to take the girl out every time she needed to. It was too troublesome for them. Now, MJ was forced to urinate right in the room, which affected hygiene, since she had no access to either a shower or a bath. The last time the girl went outside the house was when she was 10 years old, and since then, she hasn't been seen on the street. If at first MJ didn't attend school because of the pandemic and studied online, then later her father took the documents from the educational institution altogether, saying that he was transferring his daughter to homeschooling. The health of the prisoner locked in the room gradually deteriorated, but MJ was not taken to doctors, even if she had problems. The last time she was at a specialist's appointment was when she was 9 years old. Now she was completely isolated from the outside world, didn't go to school, and had no opportunity to communicate with other people. The family began to treat her like their personal slave. All this information became known thanks to text messages that family members constantly exchanged. Melissa and Savannah, bedridden, communicated only this way. Walter, who also had poor health, although he moved around the house, did almost nothing. From the correspondence, it became clear how the residents of the house treated MJ. They called her stupid and idiot, and never addressed her by name. Apparently, this was another way to completely dehumanize her and finally humiliate her. For example, in one of the messages, Melissa asked her little son to take MJ to the bathroom with the phrase, "Can you take this idiot to the toilet?" There were other examples of text messages between family members, where it was clear how they forced the prisoner to make beds for the adults, clean their rooms, or cook food for them. During all this, MJ was not allowed to take food for herself. She could be in the kitchen only under the supervision of one of the family members. In the end, although the girl cooked dinner for the adults, she got pitiful crumbs. At that time, the prisoner was so emaciated that she tried to grab something from the food at any opportunity. There were several refrigerators and freezers in the house with a bunch of products. There were food supplies in every room, but MJ was not allowed to take even a crumb with her. And if she was ever caught stealing, she was severely punished. From the family members' messages, it was clear that MJ was repeatedly slapped and knocked down, subjected to physical violence in one form or another. They even had a group chat between Melissa, Savannah, and Kayla, where they just discussed MJ. But apparently, physical violence alone seemed insufficient to them, so as punishment, they took away the girl's mattress, forcing her to sleep on the floor, then took away the TV. In essence, they took everything from MJ. She had absolutely nothing to do in the locked room. They even confiscated her clothes, leaving only underwear. Since everything happening in MJ's room was captured on camera, there were many video recordings and images related to this case. The footage showed that the girl had a severe weight deficit. The skin literally stretched over the bones, and her skeleton could be used to visually study anatomy. In fact, they deprived her not only of clothes and freedom, they deprived her of everything, individuality and self-confidence. While the prisoner suffered, bedridden due to extreme obesity, Melissa and Savannah just lay there and watched it for their own perverted entertainment. MJ was in a house where she was treated like a slave. For 4 years, her life was full of suffering. She was locked in her room, barely fed, and all this happened not somewhere in the forest wilderness, but surrounded by hundreds of people, as the family lived in a densely populated area. Unfortunately, the neighbors didn't know about what was happening, as everyone was focused on their own problems. MJ was brought to her father's house during the isolation period, so many simply weren't aware that Walter's trailer housed his underage daughter. Later, one of the neighbors said that she would have beaten the owners of the house herself if she had known what they were doing, thereby saving MJ from captivity. MJ's relatives on her mother's side tried to contact the girl, but Walter constantly found excuses. One of the excuses was that the family was supposedly on vacation. Of course, this did not correspond to reality, because the Goodmans did not leave their home at all, and some did not even leave their bed. Another excuse was a fictional illness of MJ, because of which she could not meet with her grandmother and aunt. Melissa, Savannah, and Walter almost never went outside. Melissa's younger son went into remission. He didn't need treatment for now and didn't have to go to procedures. During the pandemic, the mother and daughter gained a lot of weight, because of which their house's porch couldn't withstand the load. Even if they wanted to go out, they couldn't. The wooden flooring sagged under Melissa and Savannah's weight, and it seemed that the boards were about to collapse. And of course, Walter didn't want anyone to see MJ in such a state, because one look at her was enough to understand how she was treated in her father's house. Unfortunately, practically no one contacted the girl, and had no idea what she really had to go through. The year 2025 arrived. MJ turned 14, and she had spent 5 years in this house of horrors. Constant starvation and deprivation of freedom affected her physical health. MJ's weight for her age averaged 50 kilograms. However, in fact, her weight corresponded to the average weight of a 4-year-old child. She weighed only 16 kilograms, and she was also very short in height, about 135 centimeters. MJ was allowed to leave her room a maximum of 3 times a day, and then only to use the toilet or go to the kitchen to cook food for someone. She constantly urinated on herself. She was not allowed to wash, and every time she was led into the bathroom, she barely managed to climb in there due to weakness. She moved around the house, holding onto walls, doors, and door handles to avoid falling, and often took breaks because she simply had no strength. In addition, MJ had stretch marks all over her body, which were the result of constant muscle tension due to lack of physical activity. This happened because she was left in the room for 24 hours every day, where she just lay on the floor. The family, who were also in the house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, still monitored MJ using surveillance cameras and texted each other. Lately, they had become worried about the girl's condition. It seemed to them that she was dying. But Melissa, Savannah, and Walter were more worried about themselves than about MJ's health. They were afraid of going to prison. In August 2025, the situation continued to worsen. MJ's body weakened more and more every day. At the beginning of August, she was constantly nauseous and vomiting, and finally, the moment came when this case became public. On August 21st, 2025, 47-year-old Walter Goodman, MJ's father, called 911. Having decided, he told the dispatcher that his teenage daughter was sick and was currently lying with her eyes open and not reacting to anything. The rescuers who arrived at the scene were shocked. On the floor lay a 14-year-old teenager the size of a 6-year-old child. They had never seen anything like it. After checking vital signs, the doctors found that the blood sugar level was extremely low. MJ was severely dehydrated and on the verge of multiple organ failure. Multiple organ failure is a syndrome characterized by simultaneous damage or dysfunction of 2 or more organs or systems. The victim was urgently taken to the hospital by helicopter. The doctors did everything possible to save the girl's life. Her heart rate was dropping. MJ's life was hanging by a thread. By some miracle, they managed to save her. The doctors gave the patient an IV with nutrients, transfused blood, and her condition began to improve. After everything she went through with tremendous willpower, MJ survived. When the girl's life was out of danger, the doctors realized in what terrible conditions she had been for years. This was not just a teenager who missed a few meals. MJ had been starved for a long period of time. Her organs began to fail because she wasn't getting enough food. She had very low weight, heart problems, pulmonary insufficiency, inflammation of the liver and pancreas, problems with the spine, fragile bones, bed sores, very thin and dry skin, vitamin deficiency, poor vision, and dental problems. There was also enormous damage to the nervous system. There was almost no fat in MJ's body, and bruises were visible all over her body. The doctors assumed that she was periodically beaten, and it was possible that she could have been subjected to abuse. Naturally, after such conclusions, the medics contacted the police, who immediately began an investigation. First, law enforcement officers interviewed all the adults living in the house and started with Walter Goodman, since he was MJ's biological father and was responsible for her. Walter claimed that after he took custody of his daughter, her behavior became strange. She refused to eat and drink and didn't sleep for days. He blamed it all on autism spectrum disorder. Even if Walter was telling the truth, his arguments were absurd. If a child has problems, the first thing to do was to see a doctor. The man claimed that perhaps in her mother's house, the girl was treated cruelly, which caused her disease to progress. He also tried to explain the presence of cameras in MJ's room, saying that he watched her only so that his daughter wouldn't harm herself. When asked by the police why Walter didn't take his daughter to the doctors, he replied that otherwise she seemed like a healthy and happy child. She just burned a lot of calories, constantly running after puppies around the house. Then, according to the grieving father, she began to develop an eating disorder. And only a few days ago, MJ lost a lot of weight due to some mysterious illness. Although Walter tried in every way to portray a father concerned about his daughter's health, the detective did not believe the man. It looked suspicious that everyone else in the house suffered from excess weight and were in extreme obesity, and only MJ was emaciated beyond belief. Bed sores don't develop from active games. If she had been running around the house as her father said, she would have had at least some muscles. So, a lot didn't add up in Walter's story. The detective also talked to Melissa, Savannah, and Kayla. Their testimonies matched. They all gave the same excuses as if it had all been rehearsed in advance. However, the investigation continued, and soon, digital evidence was discovered. In text messages between the adults, they discussed the cruel treatment of MJ and how they used her as a personal slave. Among the video recordings, photos were found of her lying in her room. This confirmed that the violence was long-term and systematic. This was the most egregious case of neglect of a minor. As a result of the investigation, all 4 adults, Walter, Melissa, Savannah, and Kayla, were arrested. They were charged with numerous counts of neglect of parental duties, physical and emotional abuse, including failure to provide necessary care, failure to provide food, clothing, education, medical care, and causing bodily harm. This happened just a few weeks ago, in November 2025. Then Walter Goodman became the first of the 4 adults to appear in court at a preliminary hearing. It was then that the document on the initiation of a criminal case was made public, revealing all the horrific details of the crime. As for MJ, a little more than 3 months have passed since her rescue. She was hospitalized for treatment, as her condition was extremely serious. The doctors had to gradually introduce safe and healthy food into her diet. At first, she was fed through a tube until she could eat on her own. And soon it turned out that MJ did not have an eating disorder, as Walter claimed. It turned out that MJ loved to eat tasty food and eagerly awaited the next meal. She did not resist eating. Her eyes, on the contrary, lit up with happiness when she saw food. At the same time, MJ cast a worried glance at the person who brought her lunch or dinner. MJ said that her father didn't like it when she ate too much. Even now, when Walter was not around, MJ worried that he would get angry at her for an extra piece eaten. MJ also lacked basic skills and knowledge. Due to weak muscles, she needed help even to press the flush button in the toilet. And when the hospital staff offered her deodorant, she said she didn't know what it was. In the hospital during recovery, MJ slept perfectly in a clean bed, although according to her father, she constantly struggled with insomnia. He claimed that the girl couldn't fall asleep for several days due to mental health problems. But such problems apparently appeared in her only when she ended up in the house of big people. In the end, MJ began to eat regularly. Now she ate 3 times a day like a normal person and began to gain weight again. In 3 months, she almost doubled her body mass. However, the consequences of long-term neglect still affect her life. Several years of poor nutrition, insufficient for a growing body, can still lead to a destructive outcome. There is a possibility that she will develop irreversible damage to organs, bones, and the brain. MJ starved during one of the most difficult stages of development in adolescence, which will likely have lifelong psychological consequences. The trial of Walter, Melissa, Savannah, and Kayla has not yet taken place. Currently, all four are under arrest, and let's hope that they all get what they deserve.